We were sitting there with some people that we've known long enough that the conversation doesn't need to go anywhere. It's just very comfortable for us. It just moves. We were watching a unique show in an outdoor theater, and it was full of a whole bunch of spectacle and light and sound and craziness. And the spectacle almost made the spoken words unimportant. And it was one of those nights where nothing is trying to become anything, and that's probably what made it so easy to stay in that moment. But then a line came through from the show, and it didn't fit the weight of the table that we sat around. The line was, "It just takes one. You can be the one." Now, nobody at our table really reacted to it. I'm not even really sure that anyone aside from me even really heard it. Over the course of the night, the conversation kept moving, and I didn't really feel anything about that line in the moment either. It didn't feel like something that needed to be held onto or looked at closer, but it stayed anyway, and not in a way that was asking me for attention. It just kept showing up quietly while other things around it were happening. And I didn't try to turn it into something. I didn't sit down and think it through. It just never really left. And over time, it started to connect to something that I hadn't been willing to look at least not directly. Now, around the same time, there was something else that didn't quite feel clean, and it was harder to name because nothing about the results suggested that there was a problem. All the conversations seemed to be working the right way. The operations were moving forward effectively, and decisions were getting made without a whole bunch of hesitation. In fact, if anything, it looked like things were gaining traction in a way that should have felt settled and really stable. That's probably what made it so hard to sit with what followed me after the conversations were over. It wasn't really something that showed up while I was in the middle of it. It showed up later, when things were quiet again, and there wasn't anything immediate for me to come in and solve. There was a feeling that something had been completed in the moment, but not necessarily carried forward in a way that would hold under a whole bunch of pressure. It took time before I stopped brushing that off and just pushing aside, mostly because there wasn't a really clean example that I could point to. There wasn't anything that was breaking in a way that forced my attention. What started to stand out was how often something familiar would return, even when the situation looked different on the surface. The details would change. The environment would shift because that's what happens in business. But what sat underneath it felt like it had been there before, maybe for a long time. So I started paying attention to what happened when clarity wasn't available in the moment. Not when someone could talk something through, but when they were standing inside something that hadn't fully formed yet. That's where it became much harder to ignore. The same hesitation would show up, it was just shaped differently. It was the same need to reach for something outside of themselves that would surface even after working through similar things before. It wasn't dramatic or interrupting anything in a super visible way. It just kept repeating over and over again, quietly. And once it was visible, it didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It felt like something I had been participating in without fully seeing it, which made it pretty tough to look at directly because there wasn't an easy way to separate myself from it. That point, that's where the question shifted. And it didn't come with anything that I could immediately act on. It wasn't about direction. It wasn't about what I was giving to them. It was about where that direction actually lived once it was no longer being reinforced in the moment. I started noticing how often clarity stayed connected to the conversation instead of transferring into something that could stand independently on its own. Sitting with that didn't lead anywhere quickly. It didn't point to something that I could just adjust or improve in a clean and quick way. It just stayed there. And then it started to show up in way more places than I had expected. Now, the more I paid attention to it, the harder it became to pretend that it wasn't there, even though everything on the surface continued to suggest that things were working. I built a lot of what I did around helping people move forward, and there's still a place for that. There are moments where someone needs to see something that they can't yet see, and there's value in being able to sit with them in that and bring some clarity into it. What I hadn't stayed with long enough was what happened after that moment passed and whether anything about the person holding it had actually changed. There's a difference between something making sense and something becoming a part of how someone moves when there isn't anything to reference. That difference isn't obvious when things are going well. It shows up when something shifts and there isn't a clear path. And that's where I started to see what I hadn't been willing to name before. That was the part I couldn't move past, even when everything else suggested that I probably should. It didn't present itself as something broken, which is usually what gets the most attention, right? It just kind of sat underneath what was working and kept cropping up in ways that were easy to dismiss if I didn't stay with it long enough. I started noticing how often movement depended on the presence of the conversation itself. While I was there, things made sense because the direction felt clear. I could feel the heavy weight that the decisions carried. There was a kind of confidence that showed up in the moment that looked like it would carry it forward perfectly. But what I couldn't ignore anymore was how often that weight didn't stay the same once the moment passed and transferred. It wasn't dramatic, though I may have behaved dramatically a few times, or maybe more than a few times. And it wasn't every single time that it happened, but it was enough that it stopped feeling like an exception. It was a pattern. Something would shift, and the same kind of reaching would return. Not always in the same form, but close enough that it didn't feel new or different. It wasn't that people weren't capable, and it wasn't that they weren't trying. They were. It was something way more subtle than that. And it took longer to name because it didn't show up where most people look. It showed up in the space where there wasn't anything to grab onto yet, where a decision had to come from somewhere that wasn't being reinforced externally. That's where I started to see what I had been participating in without fully recognizing it. The clarity that was created in those conversations wasn't always becoming something that could stand on its own. It stayed connected to where it came from, and when that connection wasn't there, something familiar would easily step in and take its place. There are ways of learning that are built around that exact pattern, even if they don't describe themselves in that way. You step into something, it gets explained, it gets organized, and you leave with something that you can apply. And then it works. And it can work well enough that you keep returning to it when something brand new shows up. Over time, it can become really normal to look for the next version of that pattern. Not because something failed, but because what worked before doesn't hold the same way in a different moment. You see, the response is to find the updated version, the next layer, the next piece that will bring things back into alignment. There are also ways of working with people that go deeper into the situation itself. Someone steps in and understands what's happening. That action helps shape direction in real time. It can create movement in places that would have stayed stuck otherwise. And there's value in that when it's needed. What I had to stay with was what that creates over time, if that becomes the place where things consistently get resolved. The center of the situation doesn't fully shift. It stays connected to something outside of the person who is carrying it, even if that connection feels helpful in the moment. Neither of those paths are wrong. They both serve a purpose. And there are times when they are exactly what is needed. But what I couldn't ignore anymore was that they both leave something untouched. Because that place shows up when there isn't anything to reference yet, when something is still forming and there isn't a clear way forward. It's the moment where a decision has to come from somewhere that hasn't already been defined. And that's where everything I had been seeing started to come together. I could see the hesitation that would return. The feeling of needing to reach for something that wasn't there became more and more apparent. It was almost overwhelming that clarity would feel solid in one moment and less stable in another. And it wasn't random. It was pointing to something that hadn't been developed in the way that I thought it had. That wasn't easy to deal with because it didn't separate me from it. It pulled me directly right back into it. I've built a lot of my work around helping people find direction, and I had to look at what that was actually producing beyond the moment of help itself. It didn't undo the value of what had been happening. It didn't make it wrong. It just made it incomplete in a way that I hadn't been willing to name before that moment. Once it was visible, it changed how everything else was seen, even though nothing on the surface had actually shifted yet. That was the part that didn't let me go, even when I tried to move past it and stay focused on what was working. It would have been easier to keep building on what had already been proven, to keep refining something that produced results and was understood by the people inside of it. There's a kind of a safety in that, especially when it continues to move forward without obvious resistance. What kept showing up didn't challenge the results directly. It challenged what those results were actually built on. And that's a different discomfort because it doesn't give you anything really clean to fix. It just sits there and keeps asking whether what is being built will hold when the conditions change, because conditions always change. I started to see how often growth was tied to something that had been accessed again instead of something that stayed. I couldn't say it was made in a way that made it wrong, but I could see that it was in a way that made it dependent. The movement was real, and it was also connected to something that had to be revisited in order to be recreated. It doesn't really stand out when everything is moving. It becomes really visible when something shifts and there isn't a clear pathway forward. That's where the gap shows up. And it's not because people don't care or aren't capable. It's because the center of where decisions are made hasn't fully moved. I've been a part of that. Not outside of it, not looking at it and observing it from a distance. I had built a lot of what I did inside that exact pattern, and I had to look at it without separating myself from it. That's where it stopped being theoretical and started becoming something that I had to wrestle with directly. There's a way to keep solving that from the outside. It's familiar, and it works well enough to keep going back to it over and over again. Something changes, and you find the next thing that will help make sense of it all. You apply it, it works, and then something shifts again. It doesn't feel like a loop when you're in it. It feels kind of like progress. There's also a way to stay close to the situation and shape it in real time with someone who can see what you can't yet see. That can create movement in places that would have stayed stuck otherwise, and there are moments where that matters. It can also keep the center of decision slightly outside of you, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment. Neither of those are wrong. I've used both. I've been a part of both. I've taught both. I've benefited from both. All of it. That's actually part of what made it harder to name what I was seeing without trying to soften it. What I couldn't ignore anymore was that both of those approaches leave something in place that doesn't change on its own. They create movement, but they don't always change who's carrying the moment when there isn't anything left to reach for. That's where everything that I've been noticing started to come together in a way that didn't feel optional anymore. It wasn't something that I could just adjust around. It wasn't something I could refine instead of what already existed. It required something to shift at a level that I hadn't fully stepped into yet. It didn't feel like an idea. It didn't feel like something that I was gradually building toward. It felt more like something I'd been avoiding by staying in what was working. There's a difference between having access to answers and becoming someone who can stand in a moment where there aren't answers yet. That difference doesn't show up when things are clear. It shows up when they aren't. And that's where I had been seeing the same patterns return in different forms. I'd spent years helping people access answers. I hadn't stayed long enough in what it meant to become someone who didn't need to reach for them in the same way. That realization didn't come with a very clean next step. It didn't tell me what to build, didn't tell me how to position it. It just made it difficult to continue in the same way without feeling what was underneath all of it. The line from that night stayed with me longer than anything else around it, and it never turned into something I could point to directly. It didn't become a statement that I repeated or something that I tried to build around. It just kept showing up while everything else was still working, and it connected to something that I had not been willing to look at. It just takes one. I didn't feel it hit my ego or in the way it sounded at first, and not in a way that felt like stepping into something bigger. It was in a way that felt more like something had to stop being carried the way it had been, even if nothing on the surface suggested that it needed to. And once that shifted, even slightly, it didn't feel like something that could be put back to the way it was before.